Hello, I'm Erik Wait, and in this video, I want to provide an overview of my series on hermeneutics and recommend some books to add to your library. Now, hermeneutics is sometimes referred to as the art and science of biblical interpretation. The word hermeneutics is derived from the Greek word hermeneo, which means to translate or interpret. Now, folk etymology places its origin with Hermes, the mythological Greek deity who was the messenger of the gods, but only an ignoramus would assert that hermeneutics has anything to do with Greek mythology. To assert that hermeneutics has anything to do with Hermes is to commit an etymological fallacy, which we'll actually talk about in the series on hermeneutics. Following bibliology, the doctrine of Scripture, that is, doctrine of revelation, inspiration, inscripturation, inerrancy, infallibility, and so forth, I believe hermeneutics and exegetical theology is the second most important topic in theology, as it will determine how we read the Bible and understand the Bible and what it reveals about God, what He requires of us, and His plan of salvation. Now, there's no way I can, in a course like this, thoroughly exhaust the topic of hermeneutics. If you take a class in a Bible college or a seminary, you might meet with the professor in class, 1 to 3 hours a week. You're going to have a long list of required reading and then recommended reading. And of course, you have reading assignments in order to keep up with the lectures. And of course, you're going to have a midterm paper, you have a final paper, you might have quizzes and exams. Not going to do all that. Not going to do all that in this, obviously. But I do want to provide, in addition to these lessons, a list of books for you to add to your library. In the meantime, I'm going to cover 13 topics in the series. First will be an introduction to hermeneutics. The second lesson will be the hermeneutics of good and necessary consequence. That is, how we can derive meaning from a text, not only what explicitly states, but by what good and necessary may be deduced from a text. The third is hermeneutical axioms. That is, those principles or laws or rules of hermeneutics through which we then interpret the Bible and whether or not those axioms are justifiable. Fourth is hermeneutics and the historical narrative. That is the importance of understanding the big picture of the Bible before we get into the smaller details in the Bible. The fifth is literal interpretation. What do we mean by literal interpretation? And when people ask, you don't interpret the Bible literally, do you? And we'll talk about genre criticism. In the sixth lesson, we'll get into literary genres in Scripture, such as the historic and poetic genres. In lesson 7, we'll get into literary genres such as parables, the Gospels as a genre, and apocalyptic genres. In lesson 8, we'll get into the literary genre of the epistles, the epistolary genre, that particular format and style and that the apostles used when they wrote their epistles. In lesson 9, we'll talk about etymology, the root meaning of words, and how the meaning of words develop in time. In lesson 10, we'll talk about interpreting different forms of speech. In verse 11, we'll talk about the biblical prohibition of private interpretation and what that actually means. In lesson 12, we'll look at scripture twisting. And then in lesson 13, we'll talk about exegetical and hermeneutical fallacies, which actually is another form of scripture twisting. So, in terms of recommended reading, I would recommend the following books. The first is Gerald, Bray, Biblical Interpretation, Past and Present. The second is D.A. Carson, Exegetical Fallacies, which I'll actually use in one of our lessons. The third is D.A. Carson and John Woodbridge, who are the editors for Hermeneutics, Authority, and Canon. The fourth is by Robert Chisholm, From Exegesis to Exposition, a practical guide to using biblical Hebrew. The next is David Dockery's Biblical Interpretation, Then and Now, which is more of a historical look at biblical interpretation and hermeneutics. The next is by Klein and Craig Blomberg and Robert Hubbard. That is the Introduction to Biblical Interpretation. The next is Tremper Longman, Literary Approaches to Biblical Interpretation. The next is Grant Osborne's The Hermeneutical Spiral. If there's one book that I was going to use as a principal textbook for class, that would probably be it. The next is Leland Ryken's How to Read the Bible as Literature. That is treating the Bible as it is, as it was written. The Bible, God didn't give us a systematic theology. He gave us literature. The next is Knowing Scripture by R.C. Sproul, which is actually a fairly simple, I would say, beginner's book to hermeneutics, but I highly recommend it for someone perhaps use in accompanying devotional readings. The next is Henry Virkler's Hermeneutics, Principles and Process of Biblical Interpretation. And the final book is actually a book that I wrote that I will talk about when we look at scripture twisting. And in that book, I talk about not only my response to gay theology, but how to rightly respond with a justifiable worldview and hermeneutic. Alrighty, I hope you enjoy this series. And if you want to start with lesson number 1, I'll put a link to it at this video.